Calvin Osai was 40 years old the night his wife went live on Instagram while the police were still in their house. He had been in his home office when they knocked. 6:47 in the evening, a Tuesday. The specific time he would remember for the rest of his life, the way you remember the exact temperature of a room where something irreversible happens. 2 detectives and a uniformed officer. The warrant was for his arrest in connection with the embezzlement of $3 million from Garrison Development, the company where he had been CFO for 6 years. He had come out of his office and found Renee already at the door. She had her phone in her hand. The red indicator on the screen said she was live. He looked at the number in the corner, 41,000 viewers, climbing. She stepped aside to let the officers in. She positioned herself in the open doorway. He watched the comments coming in as they read him his rights. Finally, I knew it. Stay strong, Renee. He watched her face. She was composed. She had been ready for this. He looked at his boots while they put on the cuffs. He said nothing. He did not look at the camera. In the back of the patrol car, he had his phone for 32 more minutes. He watched the viewer count reach 47,000. He asked for Edwin's number from memory. He made one call. She had no idea what was already being uncovered. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. Edwin Marsh had spent 19 years as a federal prosecutor before he crossed to the defense side. He was 63 years old. He wore the same kind of suits he had worn as a prosecutor. Dark, precise. Nothing that called attention to itself. He had a reputation for understanding financial fraud cases from both directions, which meant he understood not just how they were committed, but how they were investigated, and which pieces of evidence were solid, and which pieces looked solid until someone looked at them correctly. Calvin had retained Edwin 4 years ago for a contract dispute that never became anything serious. He had kept his number. Edwin arrived at the precinct at 8:45 p.m. He had Calvin out on bail by 11 the following morning. He had a forensic digital analyst named Sandra on the phone by noon. Calvin was 40 years old, 6 years as CFO, 12 years in corporate finance before that. He was the kind of man who kept annotated records of every significant decision he had made in his professional life, not defensively, just as habit, the way a craftsman photographs their work at every stage of completion. He dressed without display. He drove the same car for 4 years. He had never, in 22 years of working in finance, taken anything that wasn't his. He had Edwin. He had Sandra. He had the records. And he had the specific quality that 22 years of working with numbers had built in him. The ability to hold a great deal of information at once without losing the thread of what it was trying to tell him. To look at the full picture and read it correctly, even when the picture had been arranged to tell a story that wasn't true. She had positioned herself in the doorway because she had known they were coming. He understood that later. At the time, in the 40 minutes between his front door and the processing desk, he had allowed himself only one clear thought. She had been waiting for this. The phone already in hand, the live stream already running when she answered the door. The specific composure of a person who had rehearsed a moment until they felt entitled to it. He had seen her post before, after they took his phone. Linda, his sister, who came immediately, had shown him on her screen, because she thought he should know what was being said about him while he was not in a position to say anything about himself. Renee had been live for 44 minutes. She had cried twice. She had talked about what it felt like to finally be free of someone she had suspected for years. She had used the phrase "I always knew" 4 times. She had described a marriage to a man who was not the man Calvin had understood himself to be. in a version of their life together that he recognized from the outside only. At the end of the stream, she had told her audience she was proud of herself for surviving it. Her comment section had told her she was brave. He watched it once. Then he handed Linda's phone back. "Where does Edwin need me?" he said. Linda looked at him. She didn't ask how he was doing. She had been his sister for 37 years, and she knew how he was doing. "His office," she said. 8M. Calvin nodded. He went to the guest room. He sat at the desk Linda had cleared for him. He opened the notes application on the tablet she had given him. They had his phone, and he started making a list of every transaction he could recall that had used his login credentials in the previous 24 months. He wrote for 2 hours. Then he stopped. He looked at what he had written. He started a second list. 8 years before the Tuesday evening that ended in a holding cell, Calvin and Renee had been two people who believed they were building toward the same thing, the first apartment they shared. The wedding, a small one, her family and his, an outdoor venue he had found, and she had said yes to immediately. The house they bought in year 3, a 2-story colonial that needed more than they had anticipated and that Calvin had spent a summer addressing. The deck, the kitchen, the basement that had flooded twice before he rerouted the drainage himself. He had loved her in the specific, careful way he committed to things, completely, with his full attention, without holding anything in reserve. She had started the Instagram account in year 4. A lifestyle platform. Home, interiors, food, travel. The particular aesthetic of a life that looked considered. He had appeared in a few early posts, reluctantly. In year 5, he had asked her to keep him out of it, and she had agreed. He had supported the account financially through the years it wasn't earning, and then through the years it was earning but needed supplementing, and then through the years it was sustaining itself, until the year it was generating more than his salary and she no longer needed him for that particular thing. He had noticed, in year 7, that she no longer needed him for several things. He had told himself that was not unusual, that people grew in directions their marriages didn't always anticipate. He had been to therapy twice, alone in year 7, and the therapist had asked him a question he had thought about for weeks afterward. "What are you extending this trust toward?" He had not had a clean answer. He had told himself that was not a reason to stop. 8 months before the arrest, he had come home to find Derek Amos's car in the driveway. A consultant the company had brought in. Derek had been having dinner with Renee, he was told. A brand collaboration concept they were discussing. Calvin had set that information down in a specific part of his mind and left it there without examining it. He had been wrong to leave it there. That was what he hadn't understood. Until now. Edwin sat across from Calvin at the conference table in his office the morning after bail. He had a legal pad and a pen, and the same focused attention Calvin had seen in him 4 years ago across a different table for a different problem. He listened to everything Calvin said about the past 24 months. He asked 17 questions. He wrote 12 things down. "When did Derek Amos first have access to your home office?" Edwin said. Calvin looked at him. "That's a specific question," Calvin said. "I know," Edwin said. Calvin thought about it. "The first dinner was 8 months ago. There were 4 more after that. He waited while Calvin talked with me in my office twice. The door was open." Edwin wrote something down. "Your login credentials," he said. "How are they stored?" "Browser autofill on my work laptop," Calvin said. "Which I keep at my desk." Edwin looked up. He didn't say anything. He made a note. Sandra came in 2 days later with her equipment and a methodical manner that reminded Calvin of the way precise people move through spaces they know are important. She was in her mid-50s, had been doing forensic digital work for 22 years, and had twice testified in federal fraud proceedings on the exact type of credential capture she now suspected. She spent 3 days with the access logs. She placed her preliminary findings on Edwin's desk on a Friday afternoon without preamble. The 22 transactions that had used Calvin's credentials to execute the embezzlement followed a pattern that was inconsistent with Calvin's actual working behavior. The session lengths were wrong. The time of day distribution didn't match his calendar records. The IP addresses traced to a subnet that covered a 7-block radius, which included Calvin's home address, and which also included the apartment building where Derek Amos lived. One IP address resolved to a device that was not registered to Calvin, not issued by the company, and not present on any network he had authorized. Edwin placed a second document on the table. Derek Amos's consulting firm received vendor payments from Garrison Development over a period of 22 months, Edwin said. The total was approximately $390,000. The contracts authorizing those payments were executed using Calvin's digital signature. None of them appear in any project file that Calvin was listed as managing. He looked at Calvin. The payment stream is part of the fraud chain. Calvin read the document. Sandra placed a third document. This one was a summary of financial records from accounts that had received transfers during the fraud period, accounts she had been able to trace through public and subpoenaed records. In the 18 months before the arrest, Sandra said, Derek Amos made 26 purchases that can be documented. 4 of them were gifts, documented by purchase records in Renee's name or delivered to your home address. She looked at Calvin. The funding for those purchases traces through the transfer chain to the embezzled funds. The room was quiet. She didn't know, Calvin said. It wasn't a question. We have no evidence she knew, Sandra said. Calvin looked at all 3 documents spread on Edwin's table. He stood over them the way he used to stand over a set of financial projections before presenting to the board, not looking at any single figure, but at what all of them said together, how they connected, what the shape of the whole thing was. He could see the whole shape of it. He didn't move fast. Edwin had told him directly on day 1, the temptation in a wrongful arrest case is to make noise. You will not make noise. You will give me everything I ask for, and you will let me work. Calvin had given him everything he asked for. He had not made noise. He stayed at Linda's house for the duration. He had a desk in the guest room, a tablet, and a set of files that grew over 8 weeks until they took up most of the surface. He reviewed everything Edwin sent him. He answered questions by the end of the same day he received them. He worked the way he had always worked, methodically, precisely, without rushing toward a conclusion before the evidence supported it. He did not contact Renee. He did not respond to her posts. He did not call the company. He did not speak to anyone at Garrison Development except through Edwin. There was one exception. 3 days after the arrest, a text had arrived from a number in his contacts, Thomas, 27, junior finance analyst at Garrison, who Calvin had spent 2 years teaching the work from the ground up. The text said, "I don't believe it. Tell me what you need." Calvin had forwarded it to Edwin. Thomas became the bridge between Edwin's forensic analysis and the company's internal systems. He knew the filing structure, the authorization workflow, the vendor management process. He could explain, in technical terms, why certain approvals should have required Calvin's physical presence, and clearly had not. He answered Edwin's questions at 11 p.m. on weeknights, without complaint. On week 6, he called Edwin directly. "I found something in the vendor authorization history," Thomas said. 2 contracts that had Calvin's digital signature, but that I initiated the paperwork on. Calvin didn't sign those. I know, because I never got them back from him. Edwin wrote it down. Renee posted on a Thursday in week 7. Something about healing, about what it felt like to choose yourself. Her comment section called her brave. It had been 8 weeks of this, the same language, the same audience, the same story, unchanged, because there had been nothing yet to change it. Edwin called Calvin that evening. "The Dawes office has reviewed the full forensic package," Edwin said. "They are recommending dismissal of all charges against you. They have also opened an investigation into Derek Amos." A pause. "The arraignment is scheduled for Wednesday. I expect the DA to move for dismissal at the start of the hearing. Renee will be there," Calvin said. "She filed victim's impact paperwork," Edwin said. "She intends to speak." Calvin looked at the window of Linda's guest room. Outside, the neighborhood was doing what it did on Thursday evenings. "She thinks the arraignment is the beginning of the trial," Calvin said. Edwin was quiet. "That," Calvin said, "is exactly where I need her to be." Calvin arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes before the hearing. He liked it that way. The courtroom was not a large one, a preliminary hearing room, functional, without the architecture of formality that a full trial would carry. 2 long tables, a judge's bench, the gallery behind a low rail. Edwin was already there when Calvin arrived, his materials organized with the focused quiet of someone who has done this many times and understands what organized means in a room like this. Sandra sat to Edwin's left. She had a printed version of her forensic report, the device analysis, the IP trace, the timestamp comparison, the vendor payment chain, prepared in the sequence Edwin would need to introduce it if the Dawes office required support. Thomas sat 1 row behind Edwin in the gallery. He had worn a suit. Calvin noticed this without commenting. The Dawes team arrived at 9:15, 2 attorneys, a paralegal with a box of files. They arranged themselves at their table and exchanged brief, formal acknowledgments with Edwin. Renee came in at 9:22. She addressed for a proceeding she expected to witness, not one she expected to be dismantled in. She sat in the gallery toward the front. She looked at Calvin once, a brief, assessing look, and then looked forward toward the bench. The judge arrived at 9:31. The proceeding was called to order. The Dawes lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, the people move to dismiss all charges against the defendant, Calvin Osai, in the matter of alleged embezzlement from Garrison Development. The basis for this motion is the presentation of forensic evidence that materially contradicts the digital evidence trail on which the arrest was made." She handed the clerk a bound set of documents. Additionally, the people have identified a second individual whose access to the defendant's credentials, whose financial relationship with the defrauded entity, and whose IP address history is consistent with sole authorship of the transactions in question. She said the name: Derek Amos. The judge reviewed the filing. He asked 2 questions. The DA answered both. "Motion granted," the judge said. "All charges against Mr. Osai are dismissed. The people may proceed separately in the matter of the named individual." The sound in the room was the sound of people not moving. Calvin looked at the judge. He did not look at Renee. He felt the specific quality of a room when something irrevocable has just occurred in it, and everyone present understands that it has. Edwin leaned over. "A warrant for Derek Amos was issued this morning," he said quietly. "He was taken into custody at 6 a.m. Calvin nodded. He gathered nothing from the table. Edwin had brought everything. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Sandra's hand. He nodded to Thomas through the rail. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. Renee was still in her seat. She was looking at the space in front of her with the expression of a person who has just discovered that the ground under a structure they trusted has shifted in a way that cannot be shifted back. He crossed to where she sat. He said it quietly, only for her. You told 47,000 people the truth was finally coming out. He held her gaze. You were right. A pause. Today was the day it did. He walked out without looking back. It did not happen all at once. The charges against Derek Amos were filed in the week following the dismissal: wire fraud, embezzlement, financial fraud across multiple instruments. The evidence Edwin and Sandra had built was turned over to federal prosecutors at their request. It was thorough and exact, and it was not contested in its material claims. Renee's Instagram account, 51,000 followers by the day of the hearing, had been her version of the story for 8 weeks. The day the charges were dismissed, her comment section began moving in a different direction. By the evening, the posts about healing and courage had been replaced with questions. By the following morning, she had turned off comments. A week later, the account was set to private. She received a call from Edwin about the gift purchases, the 4 documented transactions where Derek Amos had used embezzled funds to buy things delivered to her. She was not being charged. The evidence did not support that she had known, but the conversation had the specific quality of a call from which a person emerges understanding their circumstances differently than they had going in. She was carrying the weight of what she had chosen: the performance, the platform, the 47,000-person audience she had invited into a version of events that had not been true. Not dramatically, but consistently. Calvin did not follow any of it closely. He went back to work. Edwin had opened a civil suit against Derek Amos for damages. It was moving through the standard process. Calvin reviewed the filings when Edwin sent them and answered questions within the day. He met with the board at Garrison Development on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the dismissal. He had prepared a written statement of his position. The board had already retained their own forensic team, whose findings were consistent with Edwin's and Sandra's. The discussion was professional, thorough, and resulted in an offer to reinstate him. He did not accept immediately. He asked for 2 weeks. He called Thomas during that time. I want to know what you want to be doing in 5 years, Calvin said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. More than I'm doing now, he said. Good, Calvin said. I'm going to need a senior analyst when I go back, if I go back. The role is yours if you want it. I want it, Thomas said. Good, Calvin said again. He ended the call. He answered every call the same way. This is Calvin. On an evening in January, Calvin sat at Linda's kitchen table with a set of documents Edwin had sent over for review. Linda had gone to bed. The house was quiet in the way of houses where someone is sleeping well nearby, not empty, just still. The documents were a summary of the civil case timeline, which was moving faster than Edwin had projected. Calvin had been through them twice. There was one more thing to review, and then he was done for the night. He set the papers down. He looked at his phone on the corner of the table. There was a notification from Instagram. Not from Renee's account. She had been private for weeks. From a news account that had tagged him in a story about the Amos indictment. He had been tagged in these periodically. He had not opened any of them. He looked at this one for a moment. He set the phone face down on the table. He turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.